We all should have to go up and do the wave. I got it right. To comment on that, and if you agree on that.
And I appreciate what Chairman Richards and Jeff said in that regard, and I take them for their word. And all we're asking is just to make sure that commitment is there, and it is there, and I trust them. And I think one thing, though, as I indicated earlier, these projects are not shovel-ready, and we want to make sure that whatever funding source, it makes them shovel-ready so we can move forward in the MOU without waiting very long. A lot of them are in the engineering, environmental phase, and I appreciate my friend here, Jim, is closer to the ground. We want to be as close as he is, maybe more. And I also take I wish Mr. Richard didn't call Steve Heminger, so we have all the money to the south, but he did, so I can't do much about that. But yeah, I take them for their word, and I hope the final business plan is clear about that. I trust them, and we look forward to partner with them.
Mr. Chairman, may I just supplement one quick thing, if I might, very quickly? While I appreciate our colleague to the south taking us at our word, and that means a lot to me, but in the trust but verify world, I just want to make sure that you and your colleagues know that we know that the $600 million of Prop 1A funding for the Northern MOU and the $500 million of Prop 1A component of the Southern MOU have been appropriated by the legislature. This is not something we could change, and this is a matter for the legislature to determine, not for us. It comes with it all of the responsibilities and requirements of Prop 1A, and so we're bound by that. But in addition to taking us at our word, which we appreciate, we also know we're governed by this statutory authority, and the legislature has already acted on this.
Thank you for that. And I'll ask one more question, then I'll turn it over to the committee. Hassan, regarding federal freight funding, is the Rosecrans Marquardt crossing the region's highest freight priority?
Well, thank you for that question, and I appreciate what Secretary Kelly indicated. Two things. One is, I can tell you that there is not one single agency in the state of California that worked harder in making sure that a transportation national bill will have funding for freight movement. This is the first time in the history of national bills we have a specific funding coming to freight. And I want to thank both of our senators, Senator Feinstein and Baxter. This is not a 5-year work. This is a work that continued for 20-some years. Our former Chief Deputy Sharon Neely, that was her lifelong thing. She actually retired before so I called her, I said, you did it even when you're retired. So we worked hard for this. And many of you know, and I think I testified here in this committee, that 1/3 of the state economy directly or indirectly depends on goods movement. And you both know that we have 2 port complexes that handle 43% of the national freight. The needs for greater crossings, the need for adding infrastructure, the need for adding intermodal facilities is huge. So yes, we have all these needs. I would just ask to the Secretary's comment that we get this money to the right places for investment as fast as we can, and we make sure it is consistent with the Southern California plan that was submitted to the Secretary's staff for submittal to the federal government. So short answer to you, greater crossing is one of them, but not the only one. There is other priorities that are contained in the freight plan. And I will conclude by saying we support your proposed bill 2170 because we think that TCIF, the 2006 bond, $1.5 billion. In the SCAG region, we leverage over $7 billion with those monies. And that was a very successful, and I think Secretary Kelly would agree, that was a very successful way of getting goods movement to the things that create jobs in California.
So I'll just go back to the question. Is it the region's highest priority for that crossing?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Kim.
Sure. Thank you very much, all the panelists, for being here. It was really, truly an insightful discussion, and I just wanted to focus my question directed to the funding issue. in order for us to continue and see the completion of this very important project. Again, we're all concerned about the connectivity throughout the state of California, and we want to see if now that this is going at full speed, and there are some of us with a lot of concerns about this high-speed rail project, but since it's moving forward, I want to ensure that the funding will be available. You mentioned Mr. Hassan, it's easier. And as a member who represents the Southern California, it is really important that what you just mentioned about MOU you had with the High-Speed Rail Authority is really carried out, and really you gentlemen from the High-Speed Rail Authority keep that promise. Why are you here? I am hearing that you are saying that this promise made and the MOU that you enter into will be kept because it's legislatively authorized to give $600 million to the northbound project and $500 million to southbound. But it is also appropriate not just by the legislature, but also has to be approved by the court. With that, we are concerned. I would like to ask Ms. Jessica Peters from LAO and Mr. Thompson if you can elaborate on the risk involved, because I believe you touched on some of those, and ensure us that it's one thing to say we enter into good faith MOU and you are ensuring that the promise will be kept, but there are a lot of things, factors involved that may not be. And that's going to be out of your control or the legislature's control. So I want to hear some of those risk factors and what you can tell us about that.
Thank you. We referred to several different kinds of risks. One of them is litigation risk. The money in Prop 1A is still subject to litigation, and that may just be a timing issue. It may be an amount issue, but that is certainly one risk to be taken into account. It certainly could be a problem for someone like Caltrain, for example, if they cannot go ahead with their electrification or rolling stock procurement because the money they need is tied up in litigation. And I don't know how to forecast litigation risk. A second risk that we mentioned was the spending of the ARA money. That money must be spent by September 30th, 2017, or whatever isn't spent, portion isn't spent, goes back to the Treasury, and the odds of getting that extended, I don't know how to forecast, but I would say
it's zero.
I would say they're low. It isn't going to happen. Another risk that we talked about was securitizing the cap and trade funds. I want to stress that there are two different points there. One is cap and trade funding as it continues. That's one thing. And then the other is being able to sell or securitize a forward stream of income. What the private sector investor said was that they do not believe that it can be securitized to the private sector unless the continuation of the program is guaranteed and unless the share of the authority is made secure one way or the other. They would prefer a stated amount be provided, but if that's not possible, then certainly they would like to see the authority share. And then another risk would be if the authority wanted to provide something like an availability payment guarantee, which is another tool that the private sector investors mentioned. That would require a backup from the legislature to say that the authority has the right to provide that kind of guarantee. Now, I know they've not asked for that, but if you wanted to accelerate the project, providing of something like availability payments would be a way to get something built faster than it has been. And of course, the other risk that we've discussed many times is that the capital cost forecast, the revenue forecast, and the demand forecast are still based on limited experience. They are as good as you can have now, and we've not said they are not, but they are still subject to a considerable range of outcomes. And until we have a lot more experience behind us, we will not know what that range of outcomes is.
So I think we can actually capitalize on that question because the LAO and Brian might be able to help me understand the administration's plan to use cap and trade until 2050. My understanding is that at some point cap and trade will ramp down. The credits that could be sold, they'll ramp down, the credits could be sold, and that auction revenues will actually diminish as things get better. But yet the plans are to use them at the level they are today, and that's up to 2050. What am I missing here?
So we have Ross Brown of our office, who is our cap and trade expert. So if you want to go really deep into this, we can see if we can squeeze him up on the table here. I think projecting out cap and trade revenues, and Ross can correct me if I'm wrong here, can be really difficult to do, and there's a lot of factors. So you have not only the a number of allowances going down, but you have the price, and so it's possible that as the number goes down, the price goes up, and it's somewhat uncertain about what exactly would happen. I think it also would depend on how effective the state's other greenhouse gas reduction programs are and how much the cap is relied on, as well as certain other policy decisions around the cap and trade program.
Chairman, I would like to have a follow-up question to my first question.
And you'll get that chance when I get done, ma'am. Go ahead and kind of segue into that.
Thank you, Ross Brown with the Legislative Analyst's Office. I think my colleague, Ms. Peters, summarized, I think, a lot of the key uncertainties associated. If you are assuming the cap and trade program is continuing over the long term, there are a lot of different factors that can affect the amount of revenue that is available to the state overall and the proportion of the revenue that's available for high-speed rail. Ms. Peters mentioned just the interaction between, as the cap ratchets down, you're correct that the number of allowances that would be auctioned off could likely decrease, but there also would be an offsetting effect likely associated with the rise in price as those allowances become more scarce. And so you have those types of factors, as well as just general economic factors throughout the economy, what's going on with the economy, technological advancements, all sorts of things that can affect particularly the price of allowances, as well as just government and regulatory policy decisions about, for example, the portion of allowances that are given away versus auctioned off and those types of things.
So my question then being, in a financial aspect, would that kind of uncertainty, how would you be able to bond any kind of futures based on that explanation?
Yeah, so I think what we identify in our report is that given the current 25% continuous appropriation to the High-Speed Rail Authority, even if you remove the sort of legal risk of whether it continues beyond 2020, that is likely not going to be good enough, and I think is sort of confirmed by the responses from the private sector in order to structure some sort of financing against that. Even if the authority could pull something together, you'd very likely have very high financing costs to do that. And so it's in the state's interest to try and structure the funding from cap and trade to be as sure and secure as possible, so that investors, if you're bonding against it, or even if you're committing to repay a loan, or they have a variety of different options in terms of financing, you want to have that be as low of risk as possible. And so I think we had the similar findings to what the peer review group did and I think similar to what was provided in the request for expressions of interest from the private sector last fall, of providing a set amount rather than a percentage. That way, if the total amount fluctuates and the percentage drops below what would be necessary to repay the debt, that would be assured, providing a first call on the funds. It's much more likely that you would have $500 million total available coming in to repay, financing, than it is that you would have 25% would generate $500 million. And so there's things that you can do in terms of the structure of how this funding is provided to the High-Speed Rail Authority that would make it better facilitate financing. And we think that those steps would need to be taken in order to facilitate that securitization. Again, assuming you've gotten rid of the legal risk.
Understood. Thank you, Ms. Kim. And then Mr. Gray.
Thank you very much. I think when I was listening to Mr. Brian Kelly's testimony, you mentioned that it was your understanding that the cap and trade funding will go beyond what is stated in 2020. I'd like LAO to clarify whether it is your same understanding, because the reason why I ask is that the access to funds through the continuation of cap and trade money beyond 2020 is very important because it is tied to getting the access to bond funds, right? The authority will need to submit a funding plan that identifies all funding sources for the first segment of the project. And so how can they do that if the cap and trade expires in 2020? It is, I think, very important point to make, and I want some clarification on this.
There was a response to expression of interest by Barclays Bank, which I think was the best description of this. What they said was, no long-term standalone cap and trade financing is possible until 4 threshold issues are resolved. First, CARB and high-speed rail must prevail against pending legal challenges to the cap and trade auctions and to the use of greenhouse gas reduction revenues for the high-speed rail project. Second, the authority must create what they call the plumbing in law to support borrowing against the greenhouse revenues. Third, the legislature and CARB, respectively, must extend the cap and trade program in law and regulation beyond 2020. And finally, the legislature must protect the 25% of GGRF revenue flowing to the authority from future impairment by the legislature as long as financing obligations are outstanding. I think that's the clearest description of what they felt the private sector's view of the use of the greenhouse gas financing is.
I don't know if I'm missing something here, but that interpretation, you just mentioned, Mr. Thompson, that the legislature must expand cap and trade money to make it available. But isn't that up to the court interpretation? What if the court interprets it the other way? And
well, the first condition was that they have to prevail against the existing legal challenges. If they lose that, then we have a problem. But assuming they prevail against those challenges, that it is not a tax but is a charge, then in order to securitize it, and this is the issue, to sell those future revenues, you need these conditions to be met.
Mr. Gray?
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I think I asked LAO to also expand on it, so may I?
Sure. I think that there's a number of risks related to cap and trade. So if you're looking at, I think, what your background paper terms of the sort of the financially constrained, looking at the iOS North that's proposed, about half of those funds necessary to build that segment would come from cap and trade revenues beyond 2020. So that's a risk right there. If the program is not extended beyond that, our understanding is that it's not authorized beyond 2020. Those revenues would not be available unless the legislature took an action to do that, and at a minimum would be subject to significant legal uncertainty if the administration did try to continue the program beyond 2020 without the authorization. I think you're also hitting on another risk of, if you don't have a full funding plan because some of these revenues are uncertain, does that limit your ability to sell Prop 1A bonds? And so it certainly could. There's obviously a lot of litigation risk on the project that will most likely continue. There's litigation risk on the cap and trade side of things as well. I think from our perspective, the bigger piece was if you don't have the cap and trade, sure, not only can you not sell these Prop 1A bonds, but you don't have half of the money you need now to build this line. And so then you really don't have a full funding package for that initial operating segment. So I think you're hitting on a couple of different issues. I hope that clarifies.
Mr. Kelly, I think you wanted to.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, since my original testimony was referenced, I did want to weigh on this a little bit. I think I said in my original statement that CARB, I want to make sure the committee understands something first, that the cap and trade program is run and operated by the California Air Resources Board. My agency and the High Speed Rail Authority are recipients of some of those revenues under law passed by this body in 2014, SB 862. The court case, there's a couple of issues. There's no doubt there's some risk, but I want to say that there's first a court case that is generally charged with determining whether or not the structure of the cap and trade charge is a legitimately developed charge or fee. At the lower court, the state prevailed on that question. It is on appeal, and that is pending. And I don't know the date by which the court will decide that, but it's, I think, worthwhile to note that the court prevailed at the lower court level on that question. The second part is, again, we did check with CARB as we put this plan together and asked about the assumption of a $500 million revenue source from cap and trade for these purposes and whether that was reasonable. I believe it is CARB's view that they have current regulatory and statutory authority to continue the program beyond 2020. That is my understanding from CARB. That is why we included this in the high-speed rail program. But I also want to say, as a recipient, high-speed rail is a 1/4 recipient of cap and trade money. 75% is going to other things in my world and outside of my world. So on the question of would we all gain from better clarity, would every recipient program gain from greater clarity on that, I think the answer is probably yes. I would also say that the question of there was one more question that you asked about it that I wanted to
1A bonds?
I'm sorry.
The 1A bonds?
No, it wasn't the 1A bonds. There was another. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your last point, but there was an additional question about the security of the funding going forward. But I can't recall exactly how you framed it, so I don't want to answer that. I'll hold off on that until I can remember exactly how you asked it. But I would say again, the court case is pending, and again, we won at the lower level for planning purposes. We did check with CARB on the reasonableness of our assumptions for purposes of financing this program. And I would just say, I think it's another important point, and I think I wanted to make this too. Clearly, legislative intent on the availability of cap and trade dollars has been stated and reiterated beyond 2020 in many different forms. SB 862, which is the legislation that first laid out the distribution of cap and trade monies, does not sunset in 2020. And just last year, legislation that passed, SB 9, which passed with nearly unanimous vote, asked my agency to ensure that we extend the transportation program beyond 2020 in the first cycle until 2023, and then every 2 years after that. So there's certainly an intention that for not just high-speed rail purposes, but for broader purposes, cap and trade monies are available beyond 2020. I know there's some uncertainty about it. I know there's some risk, but we are going off of the best advice we got from the Air Resources Board, who runs the program.
Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you'll indulge me, I have a number of questions really in 4 different areas. First and foremost, I have some significant concern on communication. I can't tell you the number of phone calls I received upon the release of the revised business plan from local government officials, rail partners, and others in my district. People who have been involved for some time with the authority, that there was no heads up, no input, no notice of this significant change. And I want to stress significant change. My district, going back well before my service in the state legislature, to folks like Congressman Jim Costa, now Senator Kathleen Galgiani, have been intimately involved in the development of the high-speed rail plan for California. And Merced was always in the initial operating segment. That departure from the northern San Joaquin Valley is of great concern to me. So to hit on why that doesn't make sense, I want to direct everyone's attention to this map over here. My colleague, who sits slightly to the right of me, both figuratively and literally, is very familiar with the fact that constituents in my district in Merced, Modesto, Los Banos, and Patterson spend a great deal of time on the Altamont and Pacheco passes as they commute into the Bay Area for work. Now, while this plan, which is designed to provide that commuter access from one region of California to another and to get an initial operating segment up and going, it's missing all the commuters and going south into an area where nobody commutes to the Bay Area. And so some explanation of why we would go south of Fresno rather than doing the segment to Merced and perhaps even extending into Phase 2, which would make more sense from a ridership point of view and would make more sense, frankly, from a greenhouse gas point of view. So if I could get some explanation as to why that wasn't considered and why that's not part of this plan, that'd be helpful.
Chairman Gray, let me hit your first point first. I could make a bunch of excuses. I won't. The people in your community have been actively engaged in and following and supporting the high-speed rail program for many years. And to the extent that, as you've outlined it, those communications did not occur beforehand, all I can do is express to you that I'm sorry that occurred. That was not correct. And we owe you and your constituents an apology for that. And I won't try to sugarcoat it. So we'll just say that directly.
Thank you.
On your second point, it gets a little more complicated, and let me share my understanding of it. And again, my colleague, Mr. Morales, is certainly free, as always, to say that I got it wrong. But I guess the way I would answer the question is this. We've talked from the beginning of this hearing and going before that to the background paper about the various constraints that we have. And it's not something that we cry about, but it's just something we have to deal with. Legal, regulatory, the federal deadline on the Stimulus Act, the decisions where to start the project, and so forth. And as a consequence, what I would tell you is that we're not doing things in a way that would necessarily be optimal or that would be the logical sequence if we didn't have those constraints. And let me also say that even though I'm from the Bay Area, as is your colleague to your slight right, I'm very aware of the fact that the state has made a significant investment with UC Merced in the development of an academic institution there, and I'm very aware of other activities in that region and the fact that it is a region that is tied to the Bay Area already in terms of commutes. Where on the map there you see the branch between the northwest leg to Merced and the western leg to Gilroy is something that is called the Y. And that is where we have two tracks in each direction going north, south, west, as we connect to what will eventually be Merced and beyond. My understanding, sir, is that area, that portion, became very complex from an environmental standpoint, and so it was pulled out of the environmental analysis and attached to the environmental analysis of the Gilroy-San Jose piece, leaving a gap. And so when we started issuing contracts, we started south of that Y and started issuing contracts down towards Bakersfield. And the southern terminus of that, and I will tell you, the governor said to me, "Is this some kind of development down here?" And I said, "No, Governor, it's some kind of almond orchard." That's basically as far as that contract went. And that's in part also because in respecting some of the concerns coming out of Bakersfield, we agreed to stop there while we reassessed alignments into Bakersfield. And so our construction packages 1, 2, 3, and 4 basically cover from Madera, I always call it Madera Acres, but Madera Acres, down to that area north of Bakersfield. That's in the existing construction package. The first construction segment, which, as Ms. Peters pointed out, is being financed or funded by the federal dollars and then the state dollars. And that segment we have to deliver to the federal government under our grant agreement, and those federal funds have to be expended by 2017. Now, we have since made a lot of progress in resolving the issues around the why, and so we detached it from the Gilroy environmental document and brought it back to a point where we're hoping to take action on that as a board by sometime this summer. But in the meantime, the construction packages have been going south. I would like nothing better than to connect Merced. And I would like to continue to work with you and others to find ways to connect Merced. Our constraint right now is that if we stopped at, say, the Kings Tulare station, which I know is something Ms. Peters mentioned, or, as you said, at Fresno, from a ridership standpoint, that would be fine. But we risk actually losing the federal dollars to lay down track that will eventually be part of the system that connects San Francisco to Los Angeles. Now, I'm not saying this is 100% definitive because maybe somebody's got a better idea than I've thought of, but at the moment, that was the reason for that decision. It's not meant as any disparagement of your community. So what we want to try to do is both look for ways to provide better service, and we've been working with Secretary Kelly on ACE train extensions and things like that, and then continue to look for innovative ways to fund that piece up to Merced because there is ridership there. And where we're stopping, of course, it's been pointed out, is short of Bakersfield. It makes more sense to connect into Bakersfield. It makes more sense to improve. We will be able to get to San Francisco, but it makes more sense to improve that corridor. And that is a $2.9 billion increase that yields $4.7 billion of additional ridership revenues. So we have ample reason to believe that it's worthwhile to try to do those. A similar analysis needs to be done on the Merced segment, which is probably a $2 billion cost, and I don't have the ridership revenue increments associated with that. But it's a long way of trying to answer your question as completely as I can, which is to say that what you're suggesting would be absolutely right in a perfect world, but we're living in an imperfect world where we're trying to maximize the dollars we have and not risk throwing them away if we can't cut off, and we really can't at this point, those contracts to remove the dollars around. Now, I don't know if I missed anything.
Just very quickly, I also want to apologize on the communication issue, and I believe I saw Supervisor Pedroso here today, and a great leader, advocate for your region and on this program, and he and I spoke about that, and that shouldn't have happened, and we regret that. Two other quick points. One, we are continuing under this business plan and as a matter of practice to fund the preliminary work, the studies and planning and environmental for the ACE extension and other improvements in the ACE corridor. There are monies that have been specifically appropriated to do that. That work is continuing in partnership with ACE, ultimately to get to Modesto and Merced. And then also we are funding actively right now with Merced station area planning work. So we are absolutely committed to getting to Merced. As we said at the outset, the only issue here is a sequencing one, but we're going to continue to work with the county and the region to accelerate that.